Chapter 7. Gabe was unsettled, and he didn't like it. Lopez showing up unannounced and lying in wait on his porch had brought his military training to the surface instinctively. He'd left that part of him behind. No, he thought, running his hand through his hair. He wanted to leave it behind. His recurring nightmares were a clear indication he hadn't been successful. Now, Imogen had seen that side of him, the part that he'd pushed aside and closed the door on. He'd never wanted her to see him so tactical and cold. That wasn't who he was. Not really. But he couldn't lie and say it hadn't been ingrained in him through his training and experiences. The fact that she might have been in danger had scared him to the bone, bringing an urge to protect her above everything. He couldn't think straight with her there, and was glad that she had decided to take herself out of the situation. Gabe would figure out what was going on, and handle it. There was no reason for his girlfriend to be involved in any way. "Lopez, what are you doing here?" he asked her again. If she didn't answer, she was gone. Anita Lopez looked at her former squad leader, not speaking immediately. She kept her hands visible on the counter, tapping her fingers nervously, and her face was hidden slightly by the black hoodie. She was a gorgeous woman, Gabe remembered. Not that there had been anything between them. It wouldn't have been appropriate. But with her tall, willowy grace and jet black hair hanging in tight ringlets, further obscuring her face, she would have fit on any runway. Instead, she'd chosen a career in the military and dedicated her life to protecting her country, or so he thought. The last time he'd seen her had been in Asia before he was discharged. They hadn't kept in touch. She took a deep breath and let it out slowly, giving herself time to answer him. He'd never seen her less than self-assured. It concerned him. "I'm sorry that I just showed up like this. I didn't know where else to go." "First things first. How did you know where I live?" Gabe hadn't made it a secret that he was from this town, but it wasn't widely known either. "I'm between tours. When I came back home to Boston, me and some of the guys would hang out and play poker. They used to joke that you were a mountain man now." Gabe knew the guys she was referring to. They'd come out and visit if they were hiking the Appalachian Trail or skiing. It wasn't often. He didn't like having guests. On extremely rare occasions, he'd visit them in the city if one of them were getting married or having a baby. "That doesn't explain why you're here, unannounced. I could have shot you. I would have shot you, Lopez." She raised her hands in supplication. "You're right, I wasn't thinking. I got into some trouble and needed to go somewhere no one could connect me." "Are you in legal trouble? Because I won't get involved." Gabe was firm. "No, nothing like that." Anita shook her head and removed her hood. Rubbing her eyes, she admitted quietly, "It's my boyfriend. I was in a bad situation and, well, it took a turn." "Did he hurt you?" Gabe couldn't imagine anyone getting the drop on her in a battle, but she would have trusted her boyfriend. That made the violation worse. She nodded. Tears welled, but she wouldn't let them fall. She started to speak, but was having difficulty forming the words. Gabe held up a hand to stop her. "Don't worry, you don't need to tell me anything you aren't ready for. There's time for that. So, you had to get out of town quick and didn't want to go to anyone he could connect you with." "Exactly." She knew she'd come to the right place. He didn't hang out with the rest of her buddies regularly, lived remotely in another state, and there had been no phone, text, or email communication between them. "He's a cop, Boston PD. I couldn't risk staying in the city or even Massachusetts. I came here. I don't want to be an inconvenience. I just need to get myself together and figure out my next moves." It would be churlish of him to refuse an old friend. They'd been through a lot together, and he knew it took a lot of courage for her to get away and ask for help. Still, this would cause some complications. "Does he know where you are?" He had to make sure. "No, I don't think so. I already had a go bag with some clothes, cash, and a burner phone. Old habits, you know. When he was at work, I grabbed it, then wiped my phone, removed the SIM card, and left it behind at the house. I borrowed a friend's car and made sure not to drive straight here. I've been traveling for 2 days." Well, that explained why she didn't call him. She must be exhausted, as the crevices under her eyes suggested. He couldn't in all conscience make her leave and go stay in a hotel tonight. He'd have to give her the guest room, and tomorrow morning they'd discuss next steps. Grab your gear from where you stowed it and I'll show you to your room. I won't make any promises, but we'll talk after we've both had some rest. Thank you so much. I promise to stay out of your way. He doubted that. He'd have to talk to Imogen and let her know what was going on, but keep her as far away from the situation as possible. He didn't want his old life to affect his new one in any capacity. Where's the car? She grinned. Old habits die hard. I stashed it in the woods near the road and covered it with branches in case I needed to make a quick exit. He shook his head. Same old Lopez. Imogen was mucking out the goat pens when Gabe pulled up in his truck. A cold snap had hit overnight and there was a slight dusting of snow on the frozen ground, making the manure freeze to the surface. It was incredibly frustrating. She wasn't sure if it was the cold, the frozen poop, or the restless sleep she'd had wondering if Gabe was okay that frustrated her the most. Last night had shaken her. She wasn't afraid to admit it to herself. Not only was the adrenaline pounding from the stranger lying in wait in the darkness for them, well, for her boyfriend, but Gabe's reaction had completely thrown her. For a moment, she hadn't recognized the hard man in front of her. That, more than anything, had scared her. She'd known he'd been in the military. It wasn't a secret, although it was never something he talked about in detail. Because of that, Imogen had trouble reconciling the sweet, caring, and gentle man she'd come to know with the person who pulled a gun out of his car and acted like a human shield when a stranger showed up on his porch. More than his body language and the tone of voice had changed. His eyes had gone flat, like he wasn't himself. It sent chills through her even now. She felt off guard and wasn't sure which man would step out of the truck in front of her. Imogen stopped attempting to shovel and rested her hands on the handle as she heard the truck door close. He started toward the cabin, but her shouted, "Are you looking for me?" had him changing direction. His footsteps were deliberate on the icy ground, but he ate up the distance quickly. As he moved, she observed him, wondering again which version he was presenting today. "Hey, Jersey," he greeted, his hands in his pockets, stopping just outside the fence line. Was she overthinking it, or did he appear more reserved than usual? "Hi," she replied. That was a safe response, right? She hated the fact that she wasn't sure how to respond. It wasn't in her nature to sit back and let someone else lead. Yet here she was. "So, how?" They both spoke at the same time. It broke the tension, and they smiled at each other. Gabe removed his hands from his pockets and leaned them over the railing. "I'm sorry about last night." Imogen raised a brow. "What exactly are you apologizing for? It's not like you knew that would happen, right?" He waited a beat, unsure whether he could or should say. It wasn't his story to tell. Imogen mistook his hesitation. "Never mind, forget I said anything." Gabe shook his head. "No, sorry." He wiped his face in frustration. He hadn't shaved that morning, and a beard was quickly on its way. "It's just been a long night. I have to head into the office, but I wanted to come check on you first." She frowned. That was all she was going to get from him? "As you see, I'm fine." She wasn't the one who had a strange woman jump out of the shadows. "How's your, visitor?" She didn't know what else to call her. This situation was way outside of her experience level. "Lopez is fine. We talked for a bit and she's staying in my guest room for a few days." Oh. That was a bit surprising, Imogen thought. She didn't know how she was supposed to respond. Did he want her permission, or her to make a fuss that some woman she didn't know was sleeping under his roof? "Well, I'm glad you worked things out." Imogen turned around and began hammering at the chunks of manure again. She had to keep busy, or she was afraid she'd say or do something she'd regret later. She hated that she felt so suddenly distant from him, like there was a wall between them that hadn't existed since they'd met. From that first moment, they'd both spoken their minds, no matter what the situation. There was no handbook for this in a relationship. Gabe frowned as he watched her turn her back on him. He wasn't sure what he was allowed to say. It wasn't his story to tell. He kept it safe and light, saying, "Lopez is an old military buddy who's going through a hard time. She needed a safe place to land for a few days." Imogen kept stabbing at that darn pile on the ground. It was clear she was upset, but he wasn't sure how he could make it better. He was in a tough spot. Someone was asking him for help. It wasn't in him to say no. "Why are you mad?" Imogen whipped around, mouth agape in disbelief. "Why am I mad? Mad? Gabe, I'm not mad. I'm confused. I'm frustrated, and last night I was very, very scared. Do you know how it felt when you pulled a gun on me?" He opened his mouth to speak, but she glared at him and pointed a gloved hand. "No, I'm going to speak now. Last night, I backed off because I was clearly out of my element. I was up all night long wondering if you were in danger. You didn't text me to tell me you were okay or even check on me. Dead silence. Now you're here today, apologizing like we had a misunderstanding. What am I supposed to do with this?" Her breath was heaving, and he couldn't help but admire how she looked, her eyes bright and cheeks red with the cold. He was a lucky man, but he knew he owed her more of an explanation that he couldn't give right now. Last night, her safety had been on the line, and his training had kicked in. He wouldn't apologize for keeping her safe. He didn't know what to say, so he kept silent. Imogen sighed. It was like that then. He was just going to leave her hanging. She had chores to do. "Okay, well, I know you have to get to work, and I have a meeting with my lawyer in town today about my business proposal." It was Gabe's turn to raise an eyebrow. "That's right, you keep alluding to it, but you still haven't told me your idea. Is this your first meeting with the lawyer?" She wasn't going to let him change the subject that easily, and she just wanted to get out of there. Time to deflect. "Now isn't a good time. Now I've got to get going. Have a great day at work." With that, she got in the Polaris and drove to the other side of the paddock as far from him as she could get. After all, he was the one to put the distance between them. She was just making it physical.